This morning I want to continue this idea about when we face the storms of life, how we're able to stand in the face of all the opposition that often happens. Last week we talked about probably the person that some of us think of as having had the roughest time in his life, and that was the person of Job. He lost everything in a single day. And yet, all the way through his story, he never blamed God. He put his full faith and trust in God and trusted that God was going to take care of the situation even when it seemed hopeless. As we talked about last week, Job is not the only one. There have been so many others that have faced storms in this life. And this morning I want to talk about the storms that come that aren't our fault. You know, it's one thing if I did something that messed up my life or that has caused a storm, I can understand that a whole lot easier. But when I have something that happens to me as a result of somebody else's bad choices, now all of a sudden it becomes a completely different story. And maybe some of you know how this is. You're a great employee, but all of a sudden they decide to shut down the entire company. And you have to suffer for that. Maybe the doctor prescribes the wrong medication, or medication that your body doesn't handle very well, and so who's the one who suffers? Or maybe somebody was texting and driving, and you're the one that has to suffer. There are times that we can get into storms and go through situations that are not our fault. And for some people, it's real easy to get frustrated and to think that God has abandoned them, that God is punishing them, and all kinds of stuff. And so I want us to take a look at a story that is very familiar. I mean, last week we were talking about Dorian. Is Dorian still going right now? Yeah, I've never heard of a tropical storm hitting Canada. I've never heard that before, but it's still going. I mean, we're going to talk about a story about a storm that lasted for 14 days. Constant storm. And so I want us to look at this passage in the book of Acts. It's the 27th chapter, and we're going to see a very dramatic example of how we often suffer because of choices other people make. But I also want us to realize a little bit of a background in this story. The Apostle Paul always had wanted to go to Rome. Rome was like the epicenter of civilization. He wanted to go there and to preach. And so that was his ultimate goal, would be to go and to preach in the Colosseum. And he didn't go by way of a sermon series. He instead, many of you know, was a prisoner. And what he did to be able to get to Rome was he was falsely accused as a Roman citizen himself. And so they had arrested him, and he continued to go through the trial process and was now on his way to be tried in front of Caesar. And so he was headed to Rome, and that's how he was going to get there to be able to share his message. And we pick up in this particular story as he is on the island of Crete, and he is on a prison ship. And so if you find your sermon notes that are in your bulletin, and hopefully something to write with, because you may not be going through the storm right now, you probably know someone else who is. And for some of us, even if everything seems to be pretty peaceful right now, I encourage you to take notes today and to hang on to these notes. To put them in a place so that when the storm does hit, that maybe you'll find some encouragement as to how to handle that as as you face those storms. So they're in the Mediterranean Sea on an island called Crete, and it's starting, autumn is turning into winter, and Paul would have told them, don't go out. In fact, he does tell them that, don't go out. This is not a good time of year. You need to wait so that the weather is better. But we know that they were kind of impatient. And so at the top of your notes, you'll see that they got themselves out, and the ship had struck a reef and ran aground as it was repeatedly smashed by the force of the storm's waves. And the ship began to break apart. Well, this whole story is about Paul's shipwreck, and one of the three that he faced. And I hope that you're going to notice, even a couple of thousand years later, that there are some truths that are in this passage that very much apply to us, because we're going to take a look at, real quickly, some of the bad decisions, some of the things that lead to those bad decisions that can put us right in the midst of a storm. And then we're also going to look at some of the reasons that we need to remember about storms, but then how do we hang on in the midst of those storms? So first of all, what causes people to make bad choices? Number one, we begin to listen to ungodly advice. There are times we can know in our spirit, and I will tell you, the stronger your faith is, the more in tune you are with God, the more you understand what God would want in your life and in any situation. And for Paul, he knew that what God had wanted in this situation. In fact, and we pick up in verse 9 and 10. It says, much time had been lost, and sailing had already become dangerous, because by now it was after the Day of Atonement. So Paul warned them, men, I can see that our voyage is going to be disastrous and bring great loss to the ship and the cargo and to our own lives also. So Paul knew inside this was not a good idea. But look at the next verse. The centurion, the Roman officer, instead of listening to what Paul said, followed the advice of the pilot and of the owner of the ship. You ever listen to the experts and they tell you something and they're wrong? You know, it's amazing. It's like they say that we listen to doctors and weathermen all the time and expect them to be the experts, and yet they're wrong so many times. Last weekend, my kids were planning to come down. I was excited to see them. It was a long weekend. But on Friday, my daughter sent me a message. The experts say that there's going to be a hurricane. I said, honey, I've been in Florida for all my life. It's going to turn. They already predicting it's going to turn. I'm just telling you. I had to talk with God. You trust me. Nope, the experts say, and so they didn't show up. There are times that we can know something, but we trust the experts, and the experts can still get us in trouble. Another thing that can get us in trouble is whenever we start listening to the crowd. What the majority says. And verse 12, since the harbor was unsuitable to winter there, we don't want to stay here. It's not that good. The majority decided, if you would, underline the word the majority. The majority decided that we should sail on hoping to reach Phoenix and winter there. And there are a lot of people who decide to go to Phoenix for the winter. That still goes, but this is a different Phoenix. This was a harbor in Crete facing the southwest and northwest. And so they decide that the majority is what we're going to listen to. Has the majority ever been wrong? Majority can definitely be wrong. I mean, you even think back in the history of Israel, they sent out 12 spies to go look at the promised land. And 10 of them came back and said, there's no way, those guys are huge. And 2 of them, Joshua and Caleb, said, yeah, but we got God on our side. But the majority said no. And because of the majority, you know that they walked for an entire generation to die out. And they wandered in the wilderness because the majority was wrong. Now, in this passage, in this chapter, we find out that there are 276 people on this ship. 3 of them, Paul and Luke, who ends up writing this account, and then another companion. I'm sure that when they took the vote, those were the only 3 hands that said no. So the majority won out. You ever see anybody shipwreck their life because they're following the crowd? Because they're doing what everybody else is doing? Yeah, you can get yourself in trouble with that. Another thing that causes people to make poor choices or circumstances. We look at what's going on and we think, oh, this is perfect timing. Verse 13, when a gentle south wind began to blow, they saw their opportunity. So they weighed anchor and sailed along the shore of Crete. We've been waiting for that gentle south wind. And that's going to give us exactly what we need to make it where we need to go. The problem was that this is wintertime. And that gentle breeze does not last for very long. In fact, if you continue in verse 14, this is what it says. Before very long, a wind of hurricane force called a northeaster swept down from the island. We've got some northerners in here. Anybody been through a nor'easter? Yeah, you know how those things are. In fact, I guess they are calling Dorian right now a nor'easter if it gets up that far. And so this massive hurricane force wind is now all of a sudden upon this ship. And so they've listened to the experts. They've taken a poll and the majority said to do it. Then they noticed the wind had turned just a certain way, so that must be okay. And so if it feels good, it looks good, then let's do it. And they got themselves in trouble. I also want us to note that there are times we need to notice a few things about storms in our lives. First thing about a storm, and this just continues right down this passage, it's almost like this is written with one right after another. And the first thing we need to know is storms can cause us to drift away from where we ultimately are supposed to be, away from our goal. It says the ship was caught by the storm and could not head into the wind. So we gave way to it and were driven along. So here is a storm, and in the midst of this storm, they're facing a wind that is so strong, they have no control. There's nothing they can do. And so what do? They give way to it. They stop trying. And they get tired, and they're tired of fighting the wind and the waves, and they begin to drift in every direction. Whichever way the wind is blowing, that's the way it's going to go. How many of us try to control the uncontrollable? We think we're in charge. We think we know what we're doing. And what you don't realize is this storm ended up lasting 14 days that they were in this storm. In fact, it got so bad, in the next verse, The crew began to tie ropes around the ship to try to hold it together. Now, I can't even imagine being just on the ship and trying to drop a rope down the front and to pull it and move it down to the middle and then to tie it off in calm weather, let alone in the midst of a storm. And so they're doing everything they can to hold it together. Another thing about the storm, it can get you to begin to discard things that I used to think were very valuable. Priorities and values often change when you're in the midst of pain. You start going through a tough time, and all of a sudden, a lot of things that used to matter don't matter anymore. You've ever had a long-term illness and been ill for months and months. I'm going to come down here and I'm going to move in front of the pulpit. And this microphone is going to come on, and I'm going to disregard the one I have. There it is. So that I can be in control of something. You know, one of the things about going through a storm, all of a sudden the things you thought were important don't seem that important. And it's real easy to begin to toss things overboard. Look at what they did in verse 18 and 19. We took such a violent battering from the storm that the next day they began to throw the cargo overboard. Part of the reason for making this trip was to take some cargo. All of a sudden, when it comes to your life, it doesn't matter. It's not worth it. On the third day, they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. So now this is what they need to run the ship. And if they could get it taken apart, they were throwing it overboard. It didn't matter. They were trying to lighten the ship, and so they even began to throw the equipment on the ship overboard. And later on in the passage, they even start thinking, let's throw ourselves overboard. Maybe we would be better just facing the waves on our own. That's one of the things that a lot of counselors will tell you. That when you're going through a very tough time, when you're facing the storms in life, don't make major decisions in the midst of the storm. Because it's real easy to say, I don't want to live in this house anymore, and the house that had so much meaning, the things that mattered so much and have sentimental value, you just get rid of and say, I don't care about them anymore. And you begin to regret that sometime down the road. But there's something else that storms can cause you to do. They will get you to drift away from your goal and to begin to discard things in your life. But they'll also cause you to despair. That's exactly what happened. Now, note, it's been 14 days. And in Acts 20, it says, when neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and the storm continued raging, we finally gave up all what? Hope. We gave up all hope of being saved. This is just how it's going to be. It's all over with. And there are so many times that people, when they're faced with a storm, most of us would say, I can only take so much. And we get to a point where I just can't take anymore. But I want you to notice that where everybody else was ready to give up, the Apostle Paul had a completely different attitude. And we're going to take a look at that in just a second. But, it's different for people of faith. Because no matter what you're facing, there's more you know than meets the eye. And I will tell you, as a pastor, I've seen a lot of fair-weathered Christians that when God is good to them, they're praising. When anything bad happens, they don't like God a whole lot. I will tell you, it makes a huge difference when you see someone who is able to stand and walk straight, even in the midst of the valley of shadow of death. But they are able to do it because they know who their God is. And again, Paul is in the middle of the situation. It's not his fault. In fact, he even told them that we should not go on this trip. He knew what lay ahead. And he had told them exactly what was going on. And yet, Paul lets them know something is different for him. Now, some of you may not know, the earliest Christian symbol was not the cross. It wasn't even the fish, the ichthus as they call it. That was a secret sign that when you met somebody, you drew half a fish, and if they completed the other half, you knew that they were a Christian. But that wasn't even the earliest sign of Christianity. The earliest sign was the symbol of an anchor. Because of Hebrews 6:19 that says, we have this hope as an anchor for our souls. And so the anchor was something that you knew you could hang on to because it wouldn't go anywhere. And so I'm going to give you 3 truths that are like anchors that will give you stability in the midst of unstable situations. And they're all in this passage, and when you're adrift and you're being pushed along and you begin to throw things out of your life and think that certain things are no longer value and you begin to lose hope, I want you to note three different anchors to hang on to. The first one is you need to remember the anchor of God's presence. Remember that God is with me. That no matter what I'm facing, He has not abandoned me. There's sometimes we might say, I don't feel God right now. Feelings come and go. The reality is that God is with you. I love Paul. Paul is one of those, you ever have anybody that it's hard for them not to say, I told you so? Maybe you're like that. You get it on good authority. Take a look at what Paul says. After they had gone a long time without food, Paul stood up before them and said, men, you should have taken my advice. I told you. You would have spared yourselves this damage and loss. Then he goes on. Now I urge you to keep up your courage, because not one of you will be lost. Only the ship will be destroyed. Last night an angel of the God to whom I belong and to whom I serve stood beside me. So Paul, even in the midst of this storm, right along with everybody else, is able to find some amount of peace and hope because his God has not abandoned him. He is still there. God doesn't break his promise when he says, I will never leave you nor forsake you. So if you're in the midst of a storm today and you feel like, I don't feel God at all, you need to anchor to this reality that he is with you. Second anchor, Paul goes on to say, is you need to remember God's purpose. That God's purpose is greater than any storm you're ever going to face. Paul even said, God's angel said to me, don't be afraid, Paul, because you're going to stand before whom? Well, that sounds kind of crazy talk whenever you're in the midst of a storm and you've been there for 14 days. And yet, God says, I have a purpose for your life and you are going to go see Caesar. So no matter what you're facing, you need to realize that I have a purpose for your life and I'm going to see it through. You know, there are a lot of times that we look at storms and we think this storm is much bigger than anything God could ever handle. There's a reminder for us today that there is nothing bigger than our God. And He can handle anything. And even in the midst of this awful storm, He tells Paul, don't be afraid. And not only that, you're going to stand trial before Caesar. You're going to get there. But also note here, because of Paul's faith, God has graciously given you the lives of all those who are going to sail with you. So on behalf of Paul's faith, everyone on that boat was going to be saved. So if God's presence is always with me, it means that the storms cannot separate me from Him, and His purpose is always going to be fulfilled in my life. So whatever you're facing right now, you're not going through it alone. God still has a purpose. When you have that sense that He has a purpose for your life, that He is with me, there's a great amount of peace. But then there's a third anchor I want us to hang on to, and that is the promise of God. The promises of God are something that we can hold on to. Paul said, keep up your courage, men, for I have faith in God that it is going to happen just like He said. He told me it's going to happen, and I believe the promise He gave me. Now note this next sentence. Nevertheless, what's going to happen? Ship's running aground. I want you to realize God didn't promise to save your ship. He promised to save you. There are a lot of us, God, I want you to save me, but I want you to save my job too. I want you to save my house. I want you to save all these other things. He promised to save you. None of those other things are going with you into heaven. You may lose your ship, but He still has you. Just move it along. That next passage, in an attempt to escape from the ship, the sailors let down a lifeboat into the sea, pretending that they were going to lower some anchors from the bow. Paul said to the centurion and soldiers, unless these men stay with the ship, they're not going to be saved. So the soldiers cut the ropes that held the lifeboat. Oh, if the big ship can't handle it, maybe the little one can. Again, here's an attempt to be in control, to handle the situation ourselves. And Paul let them know that's not how you do it. And then he went on. I urge you to take some food. You need it to survive. So Paul, in the midst of this entire group, has let them know that God has spoken to them, that they're going to make it. The ship is going to run aground. It's a reality, but they can have hope. And he says, not one of you will lose a single hair from his head. And after he said this, he took some bread and he did what? He gave thanks. Paul was still able to thank God for hope that he had. And I want you to know that he did that in front of everyone. He broke it. He began to eat. And look at what happened to everybody else because of one person of faith. They were all encouraged and ate some food themselves. You know, even in the midst of the storm you may be facing that isn't even your fault, God can use you to bring courage and hope to other people who are struggling right along with you. And He wants to use you to make that difference. But then, as that passage closes, I want you to know, when daylight came, the officer, the centurion, ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and get to land. The rest who weren't such great swimmers, any of those in here? Yeah, okay. You grab pieces of the boat and you grab a hold of those planks and then you make it. And in this way, everyone reached land safely. Everybody on that ship was saved because of Paul. You may be in the midst of a storm right now. Maybe everything's going great for you, but who knows how quickly a storm can come up. I want to dare you to let God use you even in the midst of the storms of life, and to believe that He is with you, that He has a purpose for your life, and that His promises are something that you can anchor your life to. So no matter what you're facing, there's always hope. So if you would, let me invite you to bow your heads with me. And as we close, I just want to ask you to think about a couple of things. Have you ever felt like that you have been drifting? And maybe you're facing some situations right now that weren't your fault. And you feel like that it's just one thing after another. I want to remind you, it's so easy to be like the majority on this ship, to just give up. Start giving everything away, to think that nothing matters, to begin to lose hope. Today, you need to anchor your life to the fact that God is with you. And for those who put their faith and trust in Jesus Christ, there is an anchor for our souls that can never be taken away. If you're here today and you need that direction, you need to know that for yourselves. Again, I want to encourage you to stay for just a little bit longer for Class 101. Perhaps discover what God may have for you in your life. And as we close our time in prayer, I first want to encourage anyone here who's never known that peace, who just feels like life is pounding away. Simply open your life and say, Jesus, I ask you to come and fill me. There's so much I don't understand, but I want to know you. I want to learn to love you. I want to have that kind of relationship with you. I want to accept you into my life and to become your friend and a part of your family. Lord, you know how many people are going through tough times right now. And some of them are facing so many different kinds of setbacks, financial setbacks, and things that are going on in their health. So many different things that they're dealing with. Lord, help us not to drift, not to just throw things out and discard, to even despair and to give up hope, but to trust you and to know that in you we are able to hang on, that you have us, that there is a purpose, that your promises are for us today and always. Father, I thank you for your love, and I ask your blessings on each person here today. May we be filled with your Spirit and your love today. Hear our prayer, and all God's people said.
Amen.